in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, 2 Thessalonians, chapter 1, and we were in verse 3. Verse 3 through verse 12 is the encouragement to the church. As we begin in verses 3 and 4, thanksgiving for their growth in faith, love, and patience in persecutions. So he mentions in verse 3 that they were bound, or they had a debt. That's the idea that word bound means. They were under debt to give thanks. The Greek term Eucharistio, from which the Catholics have gotten Eucharist, from which represents the Lord's Supper, and specifically I think the bread. But it literally means to give thanks. And it was for the brethren there that Paul and his companions were under debt to thank God for them. And he says that it is meet because of their faith. Well, the idea of meet is the old English word, which means that it's appropriate, it's fitting. So it's fitting for them to give thanks that their faith grows exceedingly. Faith is not something that is static. It either grows or it diminishes. If we allow it to diminish within our life, then before long we will become an apostate. Our faith is to grow. But here he says it is an exceeding growth. It's a word which means, and this is the only time it's used in the New Testament, but it's dealing with superabundant growth. And not just an ordinary growth. The persecution that they were enduring yes? Oh, meet is it's fitting, it's appropriate. No, it's an old English word. It's fitting, acceptable, right would be another term that would be used. Yes. Sometimes suitable. Wife, or God created woman to be a help meet for the husband. That is one who is suitable for the man. Men are not suitable for men. Women are not suitable for women. But woman was made suitable for man. But their faith grew exceedingly. It was superabundant. And Robertson makes a parallel to the growth of the mustard seed. And Matthew the 13th chapter, it's the smallest seed and yet grows into a huge tree. Smallest seed to the great tree. Superabundant, or not superabundant, super growing, super growth. And so their persecutions that they were enduring did not prevent their faith from growing. It super grew. I think we have something that they sell today, super growth. in which you put it in your plants and such, and they're supposed to grow abundantly. I mean, miracle grow is what it is. Well, I've never tried it, so I don't know if it's good or not, but the term itself would certainly be kind of appropriate for what he is expressing here. Of course, we know that miracles have ceased, so it's not a miraculous growth, but it is a superabundant growth. As Paul wrote the first letter, their faith was directed in that way. Now then, as he writes his second letter a few months later, he's thanking God for that growth, or super growth. A great contrast in this would be in Galatians 1, 6, and 7. Where I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that hath called you into the grace of Christ, into another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. Here's the Thessalonians. Their faith is growing in superabundant leaps, you might say. The Galatian brethren, their faith were waning. They were not growing. And specifically, he is going to deal with the Judaizing teachers, and that becomes the reason for their lack of growth. And now then they're removing themselves from God's grace as a result. They're apostatizing. But Christianity is an abounding religion. 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 12, he makes mention, and the Lord make you to increase and abound in love one toward another and toward all men, even as we do toward you. You remember what Matthew, the 5th chapter and verse 41 teaches? Okay. The second mile religion, you might call it. Here's a soldier, forces you to carry his bags for 1 mile. That was the law. You had to do it for 1 mile, and instead you take it 2 miles. A total shock to the soldier and his system, because think of this, here's the Jews, they hate the Romans. And now then this Roman is saying, you carry my bags for a mile. And they had basically marked out the number of steps, and when they got to the steps, they'd throw the bags down. You're on your own now. I was forced to do it, but I'm not going to do any more.
So Roman law required that.
Roman law required that. And
if you didn't do it,
they would,
in jail?
they could kill you.
Really?
Well, certainly.
Okay. I'm taking a week for it. I don't even be in prison hour. Probably forgot that I was code.
I thought you couldn't talk this morning. It would be a good opportunity for them to talk about Jesus. Yes, but can you imagine the surprise of the soldier? Because he knew when that mile was up, just like the Jew did. And that Jew keeps going, and he starts wondering what's going on.
You mean they take the time to walk out how far it was?
They knew the steps.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. You were required to do something. You knew what you had to do.
Yeah, under threat of death. And you do it. But that's the attitude Jesus taught. Go the second mile. You remember, isn't that exactly what Jesus did when he was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Well, did he answer that? And then he went another one. Second is like unto it. He went the second mile. Now, we're not talking about literal, figurative, or literal miles, but it is a going beyond what is expected. In the business world, some of the most successful business people say the principle that they work by is and then some. You do what's expected and then some. Well, that's what Christianity is all about. And the Christian is going to work on that principle, even in the business world. Instead of the principle that, how many of you have seen someone who, I'm going to do what I have to do to get by. Don't want to do any more. A bunch of. That's probably the prevailing thought, isn't it, in the business world today?
That's a person that you ain't cheerful and optimistic. Negative.
Okay. Not my job. Well, yeah, a lot of times that's used instead of just getting it and doing it. But going that extra amount, doing more. Well, here, faith grows exceedingly. Go that second mile. That's Christianity. Notice Philippians 1 and verse 9. In this I pray, that your love may abound, yet more and more, in knowledge and in all judgment. Abound, yet more and more. Again, a superabounding aspect in this in relationship to love. And in all judgment. General threat, maybe. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 58. That growth is expected in love, but also now then in work. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, unmovable, always what? Abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. So an abounding work. The problem that we see in the Lord's church many times is that brethren have become complacent. You see that many times an individual is converted to Christ. And you see that individual all energetic, excited, and then Christians who have been members of the church a long time off to the side say, just give him a couple of months. He'll calm down. Yeah, you don't abound in the length of the sermon. Tim, you pay attention to that this morning. Yeah, he didn't hear a thing. But there are those who, that's the attitude that they have. So Christianity, though, is not complacent, not stagnant. We're abounding more and more. Keep going on. I think it's interesting, faith as pictured by Paul primarily in 2 Thessalonians, or what it's put with. Here in verse 3, your faith groweth exceedingly in the charity or love. That's the word there, love, literally. Of every one of you, all toward each other aboundeth. So here's love, and that's agape love that he's talking about. In verse 4, so that we ourselves glory in you in the churches of God for your patience and faith, and all your persecutions and tribulations that you endure. So here, faith is coupled with patience. So it's coupled with love, it's coupled with patience. Skip down to verse 11. Wherefore also we pray always for you, that our God would count you worthy of his calling, and fulfill all the good pleasure of his goodness, and the work of faith with power. So there's faith coupled with work. It's also coupled with power. And then in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 13, we're bound to give thanks always to you for you, or to God for you, brethren, beloved of the Lord, because God hath from the beginning chosen you to salvation through sanctification of the Spirit and belief of the truth. So now then we have faith coupled with truth. So if you look at all of these, faith with love, faith with patience, faith with work, faith with power, faith with truth. And all of these are to be growing exceedingly and abounding. Is that for a question or just John? Okay. All of these things are to abound. They're to grow. And the Christian is to grow in all of these things. And going back now to the love, the charity of each one of you, all toward each other aboundeth. An abounding love, charity again from that Greek word agape. Agape is more a decision of the mind than emotions. We think of love as emotions, not agape. There's an aspect of emotion within agape, but it's a secondary aspect. The primary aspect of agape is the will, decision that we make. That's why when Christ teaches us to love our enemies, do we have a natural or an affection, an emotion of love toward our enemies? No, probably not, right? But yet we can still make a decision in relationship to those enemies that is going to be in the best interest for that one who's an enemy. And the best thing for them is to teach them the gospel of Jesus Christ. But agape love deals more with decisions that we make in relationship to that individual to do those things that are in that individual's best interest. Let me just kind of throw in something that we'll see later on in this book, chapter 3. that also sometimes includes withdrawing fellowship from that individual, one who is a Christian, because of sin within their life of which they will not repent. And the best thing that the church can do is to withdraw fellowship from that individual. Abound here is a different word, really. But it means much the same thing. To become more, to superabound, to be in abundance is the definition. And again, in 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 12, he encourages the same thing. The Lord make you to increase and abound in love, one toward another, and toward all men, even as we do toward you. David Lipscomb wrote, "Faith in God makes man love his fellow man." And that really is an accurate statement. Faith in God makes man love his fellow man. This world, they will have a love for their own. And when I say that, their own, I'm talking about generally their own family. They might have love for some others, but very seldom do they love all men. Faith in God brings that out within individuals, to have a love for all men, not just some. Come on in. We're in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1.
Morning.
And that love is going to be demonstrated, it's going to be shown by helpfulness rendered to them. The world teaches, look out for self. Self-interest, and that's all that really matters, as long as it's good for me. Christianity, the faith, teaches have an interest in others, have a love toward others, help others, render aid to others. Don Walker wrote about this, that concerning the superlatives Paul uses here of the faith and charity that Lightfoot wrote, the words, and one translated groweth exceedingly, and then this one abundant, are carefully chosen, the former implying an internal organic growth as of a tree, the other a diffusive or expressive character as of a flood irrigating the land. So I thought that was interesting, that faith groweth exceedingly is more of an inward aspect. Your love for each other abounds. That's more going outward in its nature. And the words that he chose, or that Paul chose, groweth exceedingly and aboundeth, express those two thoughts. Then in verse 4, so that we ourselves glory in you in the churches of God for your patience and faith and all your persecution and tribulations that ye endure. we glory. Let me just kind of, in one sense, get ahead of myself. Isn't glory something that is wrong? It's one of the things that the devil uses in 1 John 2, verse 15 through 17. He abuses it, the vainglory of life. Glory isn't necessarily wrong. Here, the word glory means to be proud of someone or something. That's the word. Is there anything wrong with being proud of someone? No. It's something that's good. Now then, in 1 John 2, 15 through 17, the pride or vainglory of life actually is even a different word than is used by Paul here. So it's not even similar. But we should be proud of others, glory in them. And Paul does here in relationship to the Thessalonians. That type of glorying in them is not a vain or empty or a worthless pride that John condemns. 1 John 2, 15 through 17. It's not a vain type of glory that has no eternal value. That would be really what vain has reference to. A pride that has no eternal value in it. Pride or vain glory that does not edify, build up, doesn't give a spiritual emphasis on things. That vainglory is worldly, it's secular. There's a temporal emphasis to it as opposed to a spiritual or eternal emphasis to it. Let me just kind of, as an aside, and this isn't dealing specifically with glory or vainglory, but the church is to be interested in that which has spiritual and lasting value. Paul's statement here to them, we ourselves glory in you in the churches of God for you, and he goes on, there is a spiritual emphasis in that praise and that glory that he has for them. Well, the church should be interested in those spiritual aspects of eternal value. What we see happening in the church and has been happening since probably the 1970s and 1980s and continues on to today is a changing over from that spiritual emphasis to the physical emphasis or the temporal emphasis. And thus, it's not the faith growing. It's not bringing about love. It's dealing with this world and the things of this world. So what did we start seeing? We started seeing the building of gymnasiums. Now that has real important spiritual value, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. And if you didn't know, that was totally tongue-in-cheek. It doesn't have spiritual lasting value. It had and appealed to the secular. And the denominations had done it, so we had to try it. And watch what happens in the denominations, because invariably whatever happens in the denominations, the churches want to try out. And we've seen that time and time and time and time again.
You think the verse would be true if you read 1 Corinthians 1:10-13, but nobody gives a hoot about reading the Bible in a lot of circles?
Well, that's because, again, the emphasis has changed from the spiritual to the physical. And so now then, they started building the gymnasiums. Then they had to, well, these young people today, they don't know how to handle money, so we'll have a seminar on how to handle money and finances. The emphasis changes totally in those congregations from spiritual to secular. And about that time, we started having these ball teams in which we would play ball with or against the denominations. We'd have a softball team or basketball teams, and we would join these leagues, church leagues, where we became one among the many.
No wonder we don't think the kingdom exists yet anymore.
Well, the kingdom does exist. It just is hidden by a lot of things that members of the church do, and a lot of congregations and elderships approve of.
That's why you got 15 or 20 ministries.
Yeah, you got 15, 20 ministries. There literally has been a minister of the parking lot. I can remember joking years ago that before long we would have a minister of ministers. I had to quit joking about that because I know an individual who became the minister of ministers. I know the congregation he was with and everything. So that joke wasn't too good anymore. Had a minister about everything. And most of them, if you look at it, secular, not spiritual. John?
Yeah, that reminded me of something that when I was a young man, the church said, if you don't get baptized, you can't use the gym.
Yeah,
Use the gym.
they force some into the water in order to play sports.
Yeah. Yeah, you couldn't join the league or whatever.
Right, that was a common practice, sadly. And guess what happens when the sport sins? They're gone. Because they got won by the wrong thing.
Do they ever have time to read the Bible?
Well, they will justify a lot of those things by having a quick devotional in which they will read the Bible, have a prayer, and then let's go play. Or they will have a prayer before the game or at the close of the game, maybe even both. But the emphasis has changed. Congregations who want to adhere to the spiritual, they don't really, in our society, at this time frame, it does not appeal to the people of the world. People of the world have been taught that you go to church to be entertained, and so congregations literally, I don't know if the Lord's church has done this yet or not, but I expected, they will buy or purchase someone, have someone come in to entertain them in the singing and having basically a concert for the congregation. And the people feel so uplifted and leave feeling so good. And they hadn't been taught anything, no spiritual aspect at all. It,
An article about one of the bars years ago, denomination in Dallas, Texas. And the preacher was praising everybody. He said, in fact, some of our singers even accepted Christ.
yeah,
In their choir.
in their choir and their singers, some of them had accepted Christ because why? They weren't. They were being paid to be there and to entertain the people. The congregation was not going to worship God. They were going to be entertained. And whatever congregation, denomination can provide me the best entertainment, that's where they're going to go. Have you seen it in our town? That same thing happening? Sure it has. You look at Olive Baptist and then Marcus Point Baptist and a few years back Brownsville Assembly of God. Those things, they advertise so-and-so's going to be here.
Does the gymnasium, is that a gymnasium over to the?
No, as far as I know, they do not.
Okay. I was wondering what that big building was.
It is, from my knowledge, it's simply a fellowship building.
What happened in Brownsville, that place, when I first moved here in the 90s, it was hopping. I mean,
Well,
all of a sudden,
I think the preacher wanted to move off, and the one who was holding their extended meeting decided to move off and that or go elsewhere, and that ended it. And then they shrunk. People stopped going there. Why? Because they weren't going there from a spiritual standpoint anyway. They were going to be entertained. And I think also the fact that the preacher fell off the second story of the house that he was building, and the visiting preacher rushed over there and laid hands on him and healed him.
I'm sure.
No, not quite. Guess what happened? He went to the hospital and he spent a few weeks in the hospital. Now, and they were supposedly healing all of these people, though, but they couldn't heal him when he fell off the house. But we have to turn back or return to a spiritual emphasis in the church and not the secular. And that includes the Lord's church. I'm talking about primarily. The temporal, physical, they're going to pass away with this world. Spiritual has everlasting consequences. So Paul's glory, glorying was in the church. Again, you see the spiritual emphasis and not the physical. He was glorying in his brethren. And it is a present tense, a continual glorying.
Paul said, while the exercise profits a little, it didn't say it profits zero.
But it does profit little, and that's not the work of the church then. The work of the church deals with the spiritual. Now, should we take care of our bodies? Well, we are to be good stewards, aren't we? Seen some who didn't exercise and still lived a long life, but
Exercise with restraint.
you know, with restraint. Each individual has to do what's best for their own body. And since you brought that up, my grandmother lived to be in her 90s. Either she was sitting down at a desk or laying down on a couch.
The exception is every rule. Okay.
Now then, I say that from the standpoint, she had great health problems. When she was very young, she broke a hip, laid out in the cold in Michigan, and got pneumonia. And so she couldn't exercise like that. In fact, in Dallas, she was the very first hip replacement, had the very first hip replacement surgery. But she lived until in her 90s. So she didn't exercise. There's different things that deal with different bodies. But Paul gloried about the church and the brethren, continued glorying.
He said he gloried in the cross of Christ.
That was his glory, in the cross of Christ. Now then, he's glorying in the church and in his brethren. I'll mention 1 Thessalonians 1:8. For from you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place. Your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we need not speak anything. The church there, their faith was being spoken abroad and became an encouragement to others. That's why Paul could glory in it. And then in the next chapter, in 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 9, he mentions, for what is our hope or joy or crown of rejoicing? Are not even ye in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ at his coming? You are our glory, our joy, our hope, our crown of rejoicing. Why? Because they were being faithful to God. So we'll start there, Lord willing, next week.